Right. We've got a lot to unpack here today.
Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff.
This company, Cyclerion Pharmaceuticals, they're working in a really tough area,
For sure.
clinical stage biopharma, and they're all about these central nervous system diseases.
Right.
Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS. I mean, we're talking about conditions where people really need better treatments.
Absolutely. Huge unmet need there.
And from what I've been reading, Cyclerion, they're taking this unique approach by focusing on a particular pathway in the body.
Yeah, it's called the NOSGC-CGMP pathway.
Okay, so before we even get into that pathway, can you kind of set the stage? What's their big picture business strategy here?
Well, they're really all about addressing this massive unmet need in CNS diseases. Like you said,
Right.
it's a high-risk, high-reward kind of game.
Yeah,
Huge potential impact, though.
absolutely.
And they're trying to do this by, merging cutting-edge tech with some really new biological insights.
Now, they spun off from a bigger company, Ironwood Pharmaceuticals, back in 2019.
Yep, that's right.
Does that give them any sort of leg up, any advantages?
It definitely does.
How so?
Well, first of all, they inherited a ton of experience from Ironwood,
Makes sense.
especially in drug development, clinical trials, all that stuff.
Yeah, they don't have to start from scratch.
Exactly.
Okay, so they have that agility of a startup,
Right.
but they're not totally starting from zero.
Exactly. And they're smart about using that position.
So tell me more about these. They've got a couple of lead products, right, in trials.
Yeah, they've got Alinsiguat, that's for sickle cell disease, and then Praliciguat, and that one's for diabetic nephropathy and heart failure.
Okay, and these are already in phase 2 trials.
Yeah, phase 2, which is a big deal.
Now, I know we've got some listeners who might not be super familiar with the whole drug development process.
Yeah, it can be
Could
complicated.
you just break down what phase 2 actually means?
Sure. So you have phase 1. That's where you're mostly just testing if the drug is safe in humans.
Got it.
And then phase 2, that's when you're actually trying to see, okay, does this thing work? We test it on more people, and you're really looking at effectiveness.
So this is where it starts to get real.
Yeah, you start to see if it has the potential to really help people.
So these phase 2 trials, they're especially important for Cyclerion because, well, they're going after these diseases that don't have a lot of good treatments yet.
Exactly. I mean, if these trials are successful, it could be huge.
For patients and for the company.
Oh,
Right.
absolutely.
Now, let's talk about the people behind all this. Who's leading the charge at Cyclerion?
Well, their CEO is Regina Grahl. She's got over 20 years of experience in this industry.
Wow, okay.
Really proven track record when it comes to innovation.
So that's a good sign, but biotech, it's a tough business.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It takes a lot of money to get these drugs through the whole development process.
Absolutely.
So how are they managing their finances?
Well, they've been pretty smart about it.
Okay. So,
They're definitely prioritizing research and development, but they're also doing things like forming partnerships.
right, to spread the cost.
Yeah, and access more expertise,
So what's their overall financial health looking like?
I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag, which is pretty typical for companies at this stage.
Yeah, makes sense.
They are generating some revenue,
Okay, that's good.
but they're also putting a lot into R&D, so they're operating at a loss.
But I imagine they have a decent cash position, right, with the partnerships and stuff.
Yes, they do. They have some breathing room, but they're not out of the woods yet,
So they're playing the long game.
Yeah, gotta pay patient in this industry.
I think that's where a lot of our listeners might be wondering, okay, this all sounds interesting, but how risky is this really? Okay, so we've talked about their business strategy, their financial situation, and that really interesting science behind their approach.
A lot going on.
But I think at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to market perception, right? How are people feeling about Cyclerion?
Yeah, sentiment is it's kind of a mixed bag.
Really?
There's definitely some excitement around their potential,
I can imagine they're working on some really important stuff.
Right, and especially with the early results they've seen in some of their CNS trials, that always gets investors interested.
Makes sense. Anytime you see positive data in an area with such a huge need for new treatments.
It generates some buzz, for sure.
But you said mixed bag, so what's the other side of that?
Well, you always have to remember that clinical trials, they're just inherently risky.
Oh, absolutely.
There's no guarantees, even if the early data looks good.
And the FDA approval process, that's a whole other beast, right?
Oh, yeah, that's a long and unpredictable road.
So that's true for any biotech company, not just Cyclerion.
Right, but they're also facing some pretty stiff competition.
Okay, like who?
Well, you've got these big pharma companies. They've got way more resources.
Yeah, that's tough.
So Cyclerion, they really need to prove that their approach is not just effective, but that it can actually compete in the market.
So it's David versus Goliath, in a way.
Kind of, yeah, and you see that reflected in their stock price.
Oh, how so?
Well, it's been pretty volatile.
Volatile how?
As of January 2025, their year-to-date performance was down like 17.39%.
Oof, that's a rough ride.
Yeah, the market's still trying to decide if they can really deliver.
So high stakes, high potential reward, but high risk.
Pretty much sums it up.
Let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about market sentiment, but what about ownership? Who are the big players betting on Cyclerion?
Well, they've got a good mix, actually, institutional and insider ownership.
Okay, break that down for me.
So institutional, that means you've got these big investment firms.
Right, the big guys.
Yeah, and they're holding a lot of shares, which usually means they're pretty confident.
Yeah, those guys don't mess around. They do their homework.
Exactly, and then you've got insider ownership.
Okay, so that's the people actually running the company.
Yep, and there's a good amount of that too, which is a positive sign.
So they're putting their money where their mouth is?
Yeah, they believe in what they're building.
But of course, even with all that, the strong leadership, the promising data, there are always risks, right? No investment is a slam dunk.
Especially in biotech.
So if we were doing a SWOT analysis, what would be some of the big red flags? What could go wrong?
Well, for one, the FDA approval process, that's always a major hurdle.
Yeah, we talked about that.
It's lengthy, it's expensive, and there's just no guarantee they'll get approved, even if their trials go well.
Right, so even with good science, there's that regulatory risk.
Exactly. And then there's the competition, like we mentioned.
Those big pharma companies?
Yeah, they've got a lot of resources to throw around.
So Cyclerion has to not only prove their science, but also be really smart about how they compete.
Right. They need to win on two fronts.
And then, of course, there's always the risk that their clinical trials just don't pan out.
Yeah, early data is promising, but it doesn't always translate to success in larger trials.
It's like trying to hit a moving target. So many things can change.
For sure.
What about their financial situation? We talked about their cash position, but is that really enough to see them through all this?
That's a big question. It's been strategic, but they are burning through cash.
Makes sense. R&D is expensive.
They'll probably need to raise more capital at some point, through partnerships, maybe debt financing, another stock offering.
And each of those options has its own set of risks.
Absolutely.
That's a balancing act.
It is. They need to invest enough to move forward, but they can't just spend recklessly.
And let's not forget about the overall volatility of the biotech sector.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Cyclerion's stock price has been up and down. Investors have to be prepared for that.
Definitely a bumpy ride.
So it seems like Cyclerion is at this really interesting point. They've got a lot of potential, but they're also up against some serious challenges.
It's a make or break moment for them.
What's your overall take? Is this a company worth keeping an eye on?
I think so, yeah.
Really?
They're working on some of the toughest diseases out there, and their approach is really innovative.
But it's risky, right?
Oh, absolutely. Investors need to be aware of that.
So for our listeners who are thinking, oh, okay, this is all fascinating, but how does this affect me?
The bottom line is this. Cyclerion has a lot of potential, but it's not a sure thing.
Makes sense.
They could be huge, but they could also fizzle out.
So do your research, folks.
Exactly. Don't just jump in blindly.
We'll be sure to include links to all the sources we use for this deep dive in the description below.
Yeah, check those out.
And for those of you who want to learn even more about biotech and how to analyze companies like Cyclerion,
We've got you covered.
be sure to subscribe to the Stock Analytics AI YouTube channel.
We'll be sharing some stock suggestions in the comments of our video too.
But remember, we are not financial advisors.
This is just for educational purposes.
Always do your own research.
Absolutely. Make informed decisions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Cyclerion Pharmaceuticals.
Appreciate it.
We'll be back next week with another exciting company pushing the boundaries of science and innovation.